Good morning, everybody, and welcome to our next virtual Mind Walk. We are very excited about our guest presenter today. I'm going to go ahead and introduce him in a minute. First, let me go ahead and take care of some housekeeping items. For those of you that have joined us before, you are probably very familiar with the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen. So if you just scroll down to the bottom of your screen, you'll see two bubbles, Q&A. Go ahead and type your questions in there throughout the webinar. Please feel free to put all your inquiries there. And at the end of the talk, Dan is going to take some time to address your questions. And for those of you that have not joined us for previous webinars, you may not be familiar with our San Luis Obispo Coast District YouTube channel. Please check us out, subscribe to our page. All of our virtual mind walks will be loaded and saved on our YouTube channel and archived there for future viewing. So please check that out. The YouTube channel is full of some really awesome training and educational resources from all the way from the castle, Hearst Castle, to the coast, covering everything that San Luis Obispo District has to offer. So I'm going to go ahead and get started. My name is Robin. I am the volunteer coordinator for the district volunteer coordinator for San Luis Obispo Coast District. And I am so excited to introduce our speaker today. We have with us today Dan Robinette, and I'm going to go ahead and read his bio for you, just give you a little introduction. So Dan Robinette is a senior scientist at Point Blue Conservation Science, a nonprofit dedicated to advancing the conservation of birds, other wildlife, and ecosystems through science, partnerships, and outreach. Dan manages Point Blue's coastal marine program. His research interests include studying the population, breeding, dietary, and foraging ecology of seabirds in relation to the local and regional oceanography. Dan has published papers on using seabirds as indicators of juvenile fish recruitment to local nearshore populations. Dan has studied seabird foraging efforts within and adjacent to the Vandenberg State Marine Reserve since 2000, and has expanded this program to investigate new marine protected areas established under California's Marine Life Protection Act, MLPA initiative. Dan is also involved in the expansion of the Seabird Protection Network, which aims to reduce human-caused disturbance to important seabird breeding and roosting sites throughout California. Dan served on the science advisory team for the South Coast Study region of the MLPA initiative and is a current member of the Science Advisory Group for statewide management of the endangered California least tern and the Montezuma Wetlands Restoration Project. Thank you so much, Dan. We're so excited to have you with us. And I'm going to go ahead and turn the mic over to you.
Great, thank you. And thank you for having me. This is exciting. I like to share our work with others whenever I can. So thank you again. So today I want to focus on some of our work that we do at Point Blue on monitoring seabirds and using that science to help us or help the state manage our marine protected areas. So I'll just start off a little bit by telling you about Point Blue Conservation Science. We formed in the mid-60s as Point Reyes Bird Observatory. So many of you might know us as Point Reyes Bird Observatory or PRBO. And since then, we've grown and we've changed our name. So now we're Point Blue Conservation Science. We have about 160 scientists working with us now. And initially, we focused on monitoring birds and understanding the biology of birds. But now with all the data and the long-term or data series that we've developed, we've really kind of gain this understanding of how we can use those bird data to help us understand larger questions about threats to these populations, like threats from climate change, habitat loss, et cetera. So our focus is really using our science to help guide some of the management and other policy driven decisions that are being made to really benefit both wildlife and people. I manage our coastal marine program, and our coastal marine program really focuses on developing indicators. So again, using the birds that we see along the coast to study some of these aspects of management and restoration for coastal and nearshore ecosystems. So our goal is to really look at what the birds are telling us and use the science to guide the management and restoration of these ecosystems. And so we use our science to help inform a lot of key partners that are involved in managing and restoring these ecosystems. And so one of those areas that we've been involved in is these marine protected areas. But before I jump into that, I want to talk a little bit about seabirds in general and kind of define seabirds more specifically, so everybody knows what we're talking about when we talk about seabirds. There's a lot of different types of birds that use marine habitats, and as scientists we try to kind of categorize these different groups so it helps us study the different components of the ecosystems. So when we look at the birds that are using marine habitats, there's shorebirds. These are the guys here up in the left corner. They typically have the long bills. They're probing in the sand for invertebrates. We have things like waterfowl, like ducks and loons, also using the marine habitats. Marsh birds are birds like egrets and herons that are typically kind of sticking to the shore and trying to get fish. And then we even have raptors that we can consider marine birds. Things like peregrine falcons that are eating these shorebirds are certainly part of the marine food web. But what I want to focus on today is this group over here to the right, the seabirds. And so we're going to look at how marine protected areas can benefit seabirds, but then also how seabirds can inform us about the marine protected areas and hopefully help us manage those marine protected areas better. So just to define what a seabird is, seabirds tend to be long-lived. One of the best examples here is this Laysan albatross named Wisdom. Wisdom was banded in 1956, and she was banded as an adult, which means she was at least 4 years old when they banded her. We don't know exactly how old she was because she wasn't a chick when they banded her, but you could see here on her leg, we have this band that's been put on her so we can identify her. And she keeps coming back to breed every year. And most recently, this past November, she showed up again. So she's at least 69 years old. And not only is she still reproducing, but she's successfully reproducing. So we know these birds are very long-lived. We don't know exactly how long-lived all the different species are, but a lot of the coastal breeding seabirds that we have along the Central Coast, we know they're long-lived as well from banding studies, and at least they're living to 20 to 30 years of age, and probably more. The more that we learn, the longer it seems that these birds are living. And the reason that they're long-lived is because the ocean is highly variable. There's a lot of ups and downs from year to year. So some years there might be a lot of food, other years there might be not a lot of food. So one good example recently. This is looking at some data from the California lease turn. And so we have this year from 2004 to 2006 where we had really warm water conditions off our coast, and they just had really horrible reproductive success. And so by being long-lived, these birds have more time to be successful at breeding. And in some years, they might just skip breeding altogether because it's not worth their effort. And so over the long term, then, there's going to be more of these productive years, and these birds will be more successful if they have a long-lived strategy. Seabirds tend to raise fewer young, but they provide a lot more parental care. So a lot of the seabirds will only lay one egg a year. Some will lay 2 or 3. For example, western gulls here that we see here typically lay about 3 eggs. But that's a lot fewer than what we see with you know, some of the songbirds that you see in your backyard. And a lot of those songbirds, you know, they'll lay a lot of eggs, they'll raise those chicks, but then those chicks are pretty much on their own, and those birds might decide to start up a whole another nest within that season. We don't see that in seabirds. Seabirds will put a lot of investment in few young, and they might even continue to raise those young after they've fledged from the nest. So we see a lot of, again, this long-term strategy, investing a lot in fewer young and trying to be successful that way. Most seabirds only come to land to breed. And this is, you know, definitely what I call the true seabirds fall in this category. Some of the seabirds that I'm going to talk about today actually do come to land throughout the year. They do need some roosting habitat, but when they do, we find them on kind of these remote areas like offshore rocks and cliffs. And the reason for that is, you know, when seabirds, if we think about where they fall within the food chain, at sea, they're upper trophic level predators. They're kind of towards the top of the food chain. They don't have to worry about things eating them so much. There's some exceptions, but for the most part, they're the predators that are doing the consuming. When seabirds come to land, sorry, I'm going the wrong direction, that's when they really become prey to things like peregrine falcons and larger raptors, even, you know, coyotes. There's a lot of predators on land that are a threat to seabirds. So they don't like to come to land. And so when they do come to land to breed, oftentimes it's on remote areas like offshore islands. So this is Southeast Farallon Island off the coast of San Francisco Bay. This is the largest seabird colony in the lower US, the lower 48 states. And we've been monitoring these birds out there since the 60s. This picture to the lower left here is an example of a blind that we use to study murres. And so down below, you could see hundreds of murres that this intern has to follow. These are all nests. So they're trying to avoid these areas where they're going to be subject to predation. Along the coast, where we on our coastal program study these birds. Again, remote areas, they breed on these offshore rocks. This is a rock off of the Shell Beach area. And then cliffs, you know, again, places where you're not going to get predators coming down to get at these eggs. And even within those cliffs and offshore rocks, some birds like this pigeon guillemot here will actually go in and find crevices and burrows in that habitat. And so here you can see a couple eggs in this crevice that this guillemot has laid. So again, just trying to avoid predation, finding these isolated habitats. And so what I want to talk about today then is kind of focusing on some of these birds that we see along the Central Coast. Most of these you can see if you go out to the coast. Guillemots are one of our examples of a true seabird. So you will only see these guys in the spring and summer. But and then California least terns, this is a bird that actually overwinters down in Central America somewhere. We're still not quite sure where. So you'll see them in the spring and summer off our coast. But the rest of these guys you'll see year round because they are using the coast year round. But again, they tend to find more isolated habitats even when they're roosting during the winter. Kind of shifting our focus then, I want to again focus this talk on seabirds and marine protected areas. So where do seabirds fall within this whole idea of conservation using marine protected areas? So I want to talk a little bit about the marine protected areas themselves. California now has a complete network of 124 marine protected areas. It was completed under the Marine Life Protection Act. The last ones were finalized in 2012. And so with those 124 marine protected areas, we're protecting about 16% of state waters. And so you can see him here in this map. We have marine protected areas all the way from the Oregon border down to the Mexican border. And in addition to those, we have 15 special closures. Special closures are areas that not only are you not allowed to fish in these areas, but you're not even allowed to go in these areas. And these special closures were designed to protect things like seabirds and pinnipeds that kind of need that extra protection to keep people away from their breeding habitat. So again, you know, seabirds are seeking these isolated areas to get away from predators, but it doesn't really help if we have humans on kayaks and boats, et cetera, that are coming up and disturbing these areas. So we have these special closures that are designed to give that extra protection. When we look at seabirds in marine protected areas, we can look at this in a couple of different ways. So as scientists at Point Blue and in our coastal marine program, we look at seabirds and MPAs. First of all, we look at how can seabirds help us manage and study marine protected areas. So we look at developing seabirds as indicators. So they're tools to help us study the marine protected areas themselves. Now, this is something that's easy for us to show. We've been studying seabirds and their relationship with the ocean for decades now, and there's some really clear relationships that are easy to show scientifically. But it's harder for us to kind of take these to the public and even sometimes to managers. It's kind of a hard idea to grasp. Looking at the benefits of MPAs to seabirds is another way that we look at things. This is a lot easier for people to grasp. It's easier to understand that if you close off an area and limit certain activities, there's going to be some conservation benefits. But in terms of showing a direct benefit to seabirds, that's actually been really challenging for us to show scientifically. And hopefully that'll become more clear as I talk more. But I want to focus a little bit on the seabirds as indicators first, since that's the kind of the harder concept to grasp. And then we'll move on to looking at how can marine protected areas benefit seabirds. One of the reasons why it's hard to show benefits of marine protected areas to seabirds is that, you know, a marine protected area, the real goal is to manage fishing. A marine protected area is a management tool to help us manage our fisheries and protect our species that are fished. So they have direct benefits to fishes and invertebrates that are being harvested. And so they don't necessarily have direct benefits to seabirds, but again, there are definitely some benefits. Many of the seabirds that I'm going to be talking about today eat young fish. They eat juvenile fishes. So you can imagine if you protect the adults of those fishes, which is exactly what a marine protected area is doing. We don't fish juveniles. You know, when we go after fish and harvest them, we're harvesting the adults. But if we protect these adults, we're going to get more juveniles in the ecosystem, and thus that's going to be more seabird prey. And the interesting thing about a lot of these fish that we find off our coast, as they get older, they actually produce more and more juveniles, and it's exponentially more. So here's a good this example. This is a slide that I borrowed from the California Marine Sanctuaries Foundation, and it really illustrates this point. So here we have these are vermilion rockfish, and a rockfish that's about 14.5 inches is probably producing about 150,000 juveniles. And as we get larger, as this rockfish gets older, you could see, you know, 23.6 inches. Now we're talking about 1.7 million juveniles. So when we protect these fishes, not only are we protecting the population of that species of fish, but we're also protecting, you know, we're providing more resources for other components of the ecosystem, like seabirds. I want to show, I have a quick video that kind of illustrates this protection. of these juvenile fish. So I'm gonna switch here and see if this works. It's on YouTube, and I can provide the link later through email, or I can give it to Robin. But this is a video that was produced by the San Luis Obispo Marine Protected Area Collaborative. And it's on YouTube. I'm just going to show a short clip because it's a clip that illustrates this idea of, you know, if you protect the larger fish, you're going to be producing a lot more juvenile fish. So let me play it real quick.
The MPAs can act as seed populations, so where you have a protected population, that population grows in abundance. Also, that individuals tend to get much larger, and when we're talking about fish, the larger fish are the ones that are producing the greatest amount of offspring. Those will spill over into adjacent areas. The Point Pichon State Marine Reserve is
okay, so I'm going to stop it there. But again, this is a really nice video that the collaborative put together. So I encourage you guys you could search it on YouTube. Just look for Marine Protected Areas, San Luis Obispo County. And this one's looking from Morro Bay Estuary to Point Pichon. Let me get back into here then. But so one question that we're interested in is so you're producing all these fish. Let me switch this real quick again. You're producing all these fish, but where do they go? And that's an important question that we're trying to look at with seabirds. So when we look at seabirds as indicators, one of our main questions is can we use seabirds to tell us where all these juvenile fish are going, and are they making it back into MPAs? Are they not making it back into MPAs, et cetera? So, sorry. The reason why this is important is you know, it helps us to set some realistic expectations for marine protected areas. So when we look at the fish that are being produced in these MPAs, a lot of the fish along our coast, when they reproduce, they produce eggs and larvae that float around in the water as plankton. So over here to the, I think my pointer is working. Over here to the right, we see a lot of these larvae and eggs. And in the middle here, we see a map of some currents that we typically see along the central coast. And so these eggs and larvae are really subject to being redistributed with these currents that we see along the coast. And so those currents are going to determine where these juvenile fish eventually end up. Some of them are going to go into an MPA. Some of them are going to happen to go outside of an MPA, which, you know, either way is fine, right? If the idea is that MPAs are going to help seed populations throughout the coast, then it's good that we see some go into the MPAs, or I'm sorry, outside of the MPAs. But in terms of managing expectations for an MPA, we also need to know how many of these juveniles are making it inside the MPA. Whether or not the MPA shows signs of improvement will be largely determined by whether or not you get recruits. So it really is important, you know, to consider where we put an MPA along the coast to determine how quickly we should expect to see results within that MPA. If an MPA is receiving a lot of these recruits, then we would expect change to happen more quickly. So we would expect the line here to go up more quickly. But if an MPA is located somewhere where we don't expect to see a lot of recruits, that doesn't necessarily mean that that's a bad placement, but it just means that we need to set our expectations to allow more time to see change within that MPA. So we, you know, one of the things then that we're trying to do with seabirds is to identify where these areas are, where are the juvenile fish recruiting, and where are some of the areas where we should expect more time to see MPA effects. So we've been studying seabird diet and foraging behavior with respect to marine protected areas. And one of the things that we've found is that we tend to see a lot of seabirds foraging in the lee of coastal headlands. those of you who live along the Central Coast, you know that things get super windy in the spring. And so that wind is actually a good thing. It drives this process that we call upwelling. And so what happens when we get this wind going along our coast, that displaces water, and it actually displaces the water offshore. So when that water is displaced, it's replaced by nutrient-rich water from the depths. And that's a good thing for plankton, and it tends to make the water productive. But it's kind of a double-edged sword, because that displacement also pushes these young larval fish offshore as well. So they're being pushed away from adult habitat. One of the things that we see in the lee of coastal headlands is we get these recirculating water that tends to retain these juveniles. And so we tend to see higher recruitment in the lee of these coastal headlands. And that's, of course, what we are seeing with the seabirds as well. The seabirds are foraging at higher rates in the lee of these coastal headlands. And we see that up and down the coast. So we just published a paper now that looked at 46 sites from the Oregon border all the way down to the Mexican border. And we consistently observed that seabirds were foraging in the lee of these coastal headlands. But one thing that changes from year to year is that strength of that upwelling. And so in some years, when the upwelling's not as strong, we don't see that leeward effect is strong. And so the seabirds spread out to other areas to forage. And so by looking at the seabirds, our goal is to really get an understanding of where the juvenile fish are being delivered each year, and then use that to set some realistic expectations for how quickly we should see change within these MPAs. So for example, that Pointe Pichon MPA that was in the video, it's right here. And as you can see, it's not in the lee of a coastal headland. So that doesn't mean that it's not getting any recruits, but it means it's probably getting more recruits during these years where upwelling isn't as strong. And so if we look at seabird foraging in these areas from year to year, we can get a better understanding of when the conditions are set so that we're going to get more recruitment in the lee of the promontory versus which years should we expect to see more recruitment to MPAs that aren't in a lee of a coastal headland. So again, it's kind of a more difficult concept to grasp, but we've been really successful in illustrating that it can be used. And so we are pursuing this, and we're trying to use this to help managers with the management of these marine protected areas. But now I want to focus a little bit or more now on some of the benefits that MPAs could have to seabirds. So again, an idea that's a little bit easier to grasp, but definitely harder to show scientifically. When we look at benefits of marine protected areas, we categorize them in terms of whether they're direct benefits or indirect benefits. So a direct benefit would be would be when an MPA reduces direct interactions with humans. So an example of that would be if we can reduce fisheries bycatch, right? So people go out and fish, they're targeting fish, but sometimes, you know, we get the accidental pelican hooked, or this is a case, this is some traps that were set around the Channel Islands, and in here you could see a pelagic cormorant's been caught in that trap. If we can reduce, you know, fishing in certain areas, then certainly we can reduce the incidence of bycatch. Another direct benefit or another direct interaction that we see with humans and seabirds is just disturbance to breeding and roosting areas. So again, if we can reduce activity in areas, especially areas, you know, if we put in a special closure that just completely eliminates any human activity, then that's going to have a direct benefit to seabirds. But we can also see indirect benefits, as we kind of illustrated earlier. If we protect the adults of the fish that the seabirds are consuming, we should see increases in prey abundance over time. And those increases in prey abundance then should also lead to increases in seabird reproductive success. So we call this an indirect benefit because, again, the MPA is not directly targeting the seabirds, it's targeting the fish, right? And it's more specifically targeting the adult fish. But indirectly, if we protect those adult fish, then that should have benefits to seabirds. Again, this is something that's very difficult to illustrate scientifically, because it's a few steps away from the seabirds. We're protecting adult fish and hoping that has an impact on juvenile fish, and then hopefully having an impact on seabirds. But for us, something that is a little bit easier to illustrate scientifically is looking at whether or not MPAs really result in a decrease in human-caused disturbance to seabirds, and then how can that benefit the seabird population. So when we look at benefits to seabirds at Point Blue, this is one of the areas that we focus our research on, is this idea of decreasing human-caused disturbance. So what is human-caused disturbance? Anytime that humans get too close to either a breeding site or even a roosting site, they can be disturbing these seabirds. The most obvious disturbance would be if we actually, have seabirds being flushed off the rock. That's a clear disturbance. It causes them to expend energy that they otherwise wouldn't be expending. But there's also some more subtle disturbances that we also see. We pay attention to the behavior of the seabirds. Even if it doesn't result in a direct flushing of birds off of rocks, the behavior that we notice, it can displace the seabirds to other areas of the rock. It can cause an overall stress on the bird that can, have other effects during the breeding season and even during the roosting time of year. So, one of probably the most damaging effect of human-caused disturbance is when we see disturbance at breeding sites. Breeding sites, seabirds, as we mentioned earlier, are really seeking out these isolated habitats to breed so that they can not be disturbed or not be, depredated, etc. When humans get too close to these breeding sites, and cause these birds to move off their nests or even flush off the rock, it leaves the nest exposed to predators that can fly in and take the eggs. And when we see prolonged disturbance, chronic disturbance at some of these sites, these nests can sometimes be abandoned. And sometimes these nesting sites can be abandoned altogether for a long period of time until that disturbance issue has been resolved. So human-caused disturbance, it's not something that you hear about a lot, but it has a significant impact to seabirds, and we are working to try to decrease human-caused disturbance to these colonies. Even if it's not happening at breeding sites, seabirds do need habitat to roost as well. A lot of the coastally breeding seabirds, the ones that aren't spending their life out at sea, they do need to come to land to roost. They need to rest and restore their energy. But even some of these birds, like pelicans and cormorants, they don't have well-developed oil glands like we see in some of the other birds. So when they forage, they actually get wet. Not all the water rolls off their feathers. And so they need this roosting habitat to dry off. And if we're constantly flushing them back into the water, they're not drying off. And it's an added stress to those birds. And it could potentially even lead to hypothermia. So roosting habitat is also very important, and we need to work towards reducing human-caused disturbance to roosting habitat. So how can MPAs then help with disturbance? As I mentioned earlier, the goal of the MPA is to manage fishing activity. And so this is, again, where it gets kind of difficult to really assess the benefits of MPAs to reducing disturbance. But one idea is, if we can reduce boat activity in an area, that should help reduce disturbance. So, if we close off an area to fishing, there should be less boat activity in that area. But it doesn't close off all activity. You could still go in there and kayak and do other activities. Unless we have a special closure, like I mentioned earlier. The special closure is going to be a much more strict protection for seabirds. But we're hoping that even just reducing activity should help. But more importantly, I think, is that when you have an MPA in an area, you have this heightened awareness now. So people know that this is an important area, it's a protected area, and now you have an opportunity to really change human behavior. So, you know, you can talk to kayakers or talk to people who are using the tide pools in that area and say, look, you're in a marine protected area, and we really want to focus on protecting everything within this area. And so now you can give them some rules and guidelines to follow. And so again, if we can change that human behavior, then we can reduce disturbance to these seabirds. And I think that's really important, changing human behavior, because most humans don't want to do damage to the area that they're in, but oftentimes they just don't know. So this is an example of a tour boat in the that we encountered in our work in the Central Coast. You can see the boat here to the left in this picture. It was this small inflatable, you know, Zodiac that the guy would take I think groups of 4 to 6 people, and they would kind of zoom around up and down the waves, have a lot of fun. But he also took them to see wildlife. And so this lower picture here, this is actually a picture that we got off of their website. And so they're you know, showing, this is illustrating what you might see on one of these tours. And so the quote is from somebody who took the tour, and basically they're saying, you know, we had a great time, had an amazing tour off the coast, and even more fun racing over the swells with Captain Mike. Got really close to a raft of otters and a crazy looking jellyfish. Then we checked out the cliffs and nesting cormorants. So obviously these people have an interest in wildlife. They're fascinated by wildlife. I don't think that they want to do harm to wildlife, but they don't understand that when you get too close to the cliffs and the nesting cormorants, as you know, they recognize what these species were, this can happen. And when you flush these birds off those nests, or even if you just flush them off the roosting habitat, like we mentioned earlier, that's doing harm. So given that these people are interested in wildlife and fascinated by wildlife, this is an opportunity that we can educate those people and hopefully change their behavior so that they can learn ways to enjoy the wildlife, still see everything that they saw here in this quote, but do it in a responsible way so that we don't end up with birds flushing off the rock. Teach them that this picture, even though it looks really cool and you have birds and wildlife in action, this is a very damaging thing that's happening to these birds right now. And so we can use then the MPAs to change this behavior. So our MPA work then is really focused on taking that information that we're using during monitoring. You know, we go out and we document these disturbances and how often they're happening, where they're happening, how many birds are being flushed. And then we use that, we give that information to our partners, and we're starting to develop community science groups that will go out there and help us collect the information and then use that information in public outreach. So here's, you know, state parks with a booth that's teaching folks about seabirds and seabird disturbance. So having these partnerships that are with folks like state parks who are willing to use our science and having these great volunteers that are willing to go help us be the eyes out there and collect data for us. This is a way that we can now take that MPA and leverage it and really use it to educate people and hopefully change behaviors out there. And so one of the things that we're developing is this site called Seabird Aware. It's not live yet, but we're hoping within the next year we'll get this live. And this is a place where our community scientists will interact. And it's also a place where everybody can go to get information on seabirds and information on disturbance. outreach materials, etc. And so here's an example of one of the pages that we'll have. The community scientists will be able to enter their data into this, basically it's a data portal, and they'll be able to view the data. So we have a couple of tools. Here's a mapping tool that allows us to map where seabird colonies are. And so you can see where the density of seabirds are. You can zoom into different areas of the coast. There's another tool that allows us to look at changes in seabird populations over time. So in areas where these community scientists have been collecting data over multiple years, we'll be able to see, what are the seabirds doing from year to year? What are the trends? And then there's again, like I said, there's information here on threats. We'll have outreach materials on this site. And so we're really hoping that it will be a place where people can go to learn more about seabirds, learn more about these issues of disturbance, learn more about the marine protected areas. And again, with this information and with our partners, we can hopefully really change human behavior and leverage that MPA to really make a difference for seabirds. So just in summary, MPAs, we think, can really heighten awareness about seabird conservation, and that might be one of their strongest benefits. And then seabirds themselves can be used to help us teach about MPAs and hopefully change that behavior. And then also seabirds can help us as tools to study juvenile recruitment so that managers can start really setting some realistic expectations for changes that we might see within these marine protected areas. And so with that, and if you are locally on the Central Coast, one of our partners right now that does have an active community science program, and they've been working with us for years now, is the Morro Coast Audubon Society. So if you're interested, I believe obviously this year is a very different year for all of us. And so we don't have volunteers, unfortunately, going out there consistently this year, but hopefully 2021 will be a very different year for us, and we'll have our community scientists back out collecting data for us. So if you're interested in this program and you're in the Morro Bay area, I would encourage you to contact Sarah Snyder to see what volunteer opportunities she has available for you guys.